had a special request to go over some armor stuff and equipment, what I use for dueling. Somebody who has some experience with Buhurt, but wanted to get a little bit more into dueling, was asking some questions. I'll start with what's close by, even though it's not the most important. My dueling shield, you can probably tell it's pretty light. I actually brought a scale here. It is plywood with fabric over it and a rawhide edge. I'm a super big fan of the rawhide edge. I could probably do a whole video on just how to do the rawhide. Let's see what my weight is here. Hi Ryan. My weight is 5.2 pounds. Yeah, that's pounds. 5.2 pounds for the shield. It's actually more than I thought it would be. And I use a center grip. Part of that is because I come from SCA stuff where a lot of people do center grips. It is, I think, starting to get more popular in steel fighting, although most of the Europeans and people overseas still don't do this. I will draw a parallel in that SCA fighting has been around for around 60 years, and for the first 35 years of that, people didn't really use center grips either. They all thought that side strip shields were the way to go. The whole styles were developed around nobody ever using a center grip, and then some people started doing it and having some success, and the art kind of evolved into using center grips nowhere. Now they're fairly standard. I suspect something very similar may happen in sword and shield dueling in HMD and IMCF style fighting. It creates more range, more opportunities, and in the SCA you're not allowed to use the shield aggressively. Here you are allowed to use the shield aggressively, but you're not allowed to get points by striking, so there's no advantage to having a side strap to strike with. But being able to take the face of the shield and use it, number one, to blind an opponent, pushing the face of the shield at the opponent while you're throwing shots without having to get in the way or get too close to them, and also them being able to manipulate it without having control of your body. I can still maneuver my body even if my opponent hooks my shield, gets a hold of the shield. I can change angles on the shield just fine without having to let them have control of me. And also it works better at longer range because I can reach out with it. If it's on my shoulder, if it's on my arm, there's only so far out I can reach. Whereas here I can reach much further. I think there's a lot more advantages to it than there are disadvantages. Obviously there are advantages and disadvantages to anything. Here I have a Tilco sword. These have been very popular for a good while. They're very lightweight and weighted very much towards the back, so that it's a very fast sword. This one I had to add extra weight to at the hilt in order to make it meet HMB rules. It came IMCF legal 1,200 something grams, but not 1,300 grams. So it's a very quick sword. It has a little bit of a disadvantage in that it's light enough you can get kind of the look of only using a wrist even if you're not, because you can get a lot of movement this way. My preferred sword is actually this Kingslayer. It's slightly shorter, which is a disadvantage, slightly heavier, slightly more tip heavy, and also much stiffer. And so the stiffness is great because it makes your recovery better, makes your blows land more square, not get funny angles, which makes your return better. Even though power is not an super important thing in duels, there is definitely some advantage to making a nice thump sometimes, especially people who like to game the system by doing the minimum amount of armor. When you hit them with a solid sword, that changes their fighting style slightly. And this one, because of the weight of it, when you throw it, it tends to look more like it's throwing a blow, require a little bit more of what looks like a good mechanic. And speaking of mechanics, and specifically to the person who asked me for some instructions, sorry, I'm looking down because I'm looking at myself on the screen here. Overswinging. People coming from Buhurt, from team fighting, blows tend to be whole body shots, and I even see a lot of head movement going offline as people try to throw. Well, even in Buhurt, there's no reason to sling your head when you throw a blow. Really, you should be pivoting on your center to throw a blow so that you don't move your helmet back and forth. As an unarmored person, and a lot of people develop this bad habit because they start out offer fighting, they don't start out in armor, and they sort of develop this habit. It's really easy to move your head, move your body around, and so you can swing your sword and have all kinds of weird mechanics as you swing your sword. But when you put 10 or 15 pounds on your head plus 40, 50 pounds of armor, all of that extra movement when you throw a blow has a cost. So if you want to lean offline in order to dodge, which I don't recommend, but if you do, that's fine. But you should never be leaning offline or moving all this just to throw a blow. You should be able to throw all your blows. And if you walk at me from the side, I'm throwing my whole body into the shot, right? I'm twisting on my shoulder, but my head's not moving. So if at all possible, 99% of the shots you throw, and I try not to hit my lamp in my living room here, but 99% of the shots you throw should not involve any head movement, right? Because that's just wasted energy and you have to recover back the other direction. Plus, if I throw to one side, let's say I throw it onside and then I want to recover and I want to throw it offside and my head is in a line, I can do that, right? I go from one to the other. I go from one to the other. If I throw offline when I do it, I throw offline, then I have to throw offline the other way. Creates a lot more telegraphing to my opponent, also just wastes a whole ton of energy. I'm an old man, there's no way I can use all that energy. So just some things to think about. And so I highly recommend, I have some other videos online that are older about shot mechanics, how to throw a blow with a chopping motion or a cutting motion versus a snapping motion versus a torque. And if you learn the differences between those and you learn how to take advantage of the snap as opposed to the chop, you can get a lot more power with a lot less energy and also have a lot more reach and a lot more speed. And so that's as much as I'm going to say about that for this video. If you want to look more into that, look at some of my older videos on YouTube because this is more of an equipment video. Longsword, again, I have a Tilco. It's sort of a minimum weight because there's not much of an advantage. You can always hit hard with a longsword. It's not hard to hit hard with a longsword. You don't really need the weight for an advantage, so the less weight and the more back heavy is good for dueling, just because it gives you more speed. These are not the most durable in the world. Mine is kind of messed up. So, you know, there's probably better swords out there, but that's what I'm using. The next thing we should probably talk about is gauntlets. Let me open an armor bag here. So I have quite a few gauntlets because I use different gauntlets for different purposes. I'm specialized in that. This is, well, I'm going to get a little closer with it. This is my pride and joy. I have a pair of these, but the other one is currently out of service, and that'll bring up, that's a good segue into talking about gauntlets. So having gauntlets is kind of like having a race car. You can make them protective, you can make them mobile, you can make them durable, and then maybe you can make them cheap, but you cannot do all of those things. So to get good mobility, really good mobility, you're going to give up either protection or durability. In this case, I'm giving up a lot of durability in that these need frequent repair because the glove liner rips out. Everything has to be stitched in order for my hand to fit in appropriately, in order for the split fingers to stay on my fingers in the right place where they're supposed to be so that I'm protected and I have full motion. So for me, that's a reasonable price to pay because I like to be able to have a full potential grip change on my swords. So I can go from a handshake grip, which is in line with my hand, to a fist grip, to an okay grip. All of those are options for me because I have this mobility in my hand. There are mitten gauntlets that will allow you to do almost as much if they're well designed. There's ones called the Bomb Proof and Bomb Proof 2.0. My partner, Mike's partner, had those, and they give you more than enough movement for longsword, and mostly enough movement for single-handed sword, although there's never such a thing as too much movement for single-handed sword. The more you get, the better. Another way to go about this, to give you almost as much movement with a lot more protection, is to go along kind of the almost hoof design. This is technically not a hoof because it is a gauntlet, it opens and closes, and you can drop your sword in it. I'm going to get that out, it's gross. But if you notice the way it's designed, and all mitten gauntlets that you duel with should be this way, this part needs to be cut out pretty far, and you need to have a little bit of extension here in order to be able to get the sword to move the angle. So if you notice, I don't have quite as much extension with this. I can't throw quite as far a blow. And this is what I used all weekend at DragonCon because I was just keeping my fingers safe. Hey there, for some reason my video cut off part of what I was saying. So I'm re-recording a little bit about the gauntlet. So I was in the middle of talking about gauntlet movement. I showed the hoof here, kind of hoof style, and then there's also the classic mitten gauntlet. If a mitten gauntlet is well made, it can work fine for dueling. A gauntlet like this is more than enough movement for longsword fighting, as long as it is cut out in the palm, pretty low on the palm, so that a sword can be at an angle to the palm and not straight in a fist grip. I'm going to take the gauntlet off so you can see better what I'm talking about. If your gauntlet is made in such a way that you can really only grip a weapon at 90 degrees to your fingers in what I call a fist grip, and so you only have this wrist movement, then you're never going to swing it effectively for dueling. That's fine for Buhurt, where you don't really care about finesse and you're just trying to like use your arm to get power. But if you're trying to actually swing a sword the way they do historically, which we now know how they did it historically, or the way it is sports effective, you need to be able to angle the sword in your hand. So if your mitten gauntlet has too much metal here at the wrist, is not cut out, and you can't do this, it's not going to work for dueling. But yes, you can use mitten gauntlets. They just have to be able to allow this much movement in your palm. If you had a gauntlet that give you enough thumb movement to be able to, what they call a saber grip, where your thumb goes on the back of the sword, this can be useful. There are some blows, some positions where this actually is a huge advantage. But there really aren't gauntlets made that are safe enough for hard steel fighting that give you that much movement in your thumb, because the fact that your thumb is a little bit stiff is part of what keeps it from getting ripped off, right? So bent over and broken. So don't worry about that movement. As long as you can basically go 45 degrees or near parallel to your palm, and you can go 90 degrees to your palm, and it's good if you can also go a little bit the opposite direction, what I call the OK grip. Hope I'm not repeating because I don't know where the cutoff was. What I call an OK grip, which is your first fingers are tight and your last fingers are loose. This is what we call it in the SCA. It's also akin to the way Kendo people swing a sword, where they have the loose grip with the back fingers and a tight grip with the front finger. And then at the point of impact, the bottom fingers curl and get tight. And that pulling motion with the bottom fingers helps to get your power and forces the sword forward and gives you more extension. You should be able to do that with your gauntlets on. That's the end of that. Part of the arm armor was also cut out, so let me show you my arm armor. So here's my arm armor. This is a little bit unusual and different. Not everybody's going to want to do this. You notice it's not very many pieces. There are no straps. This is essentially a solid piece that my arm fits in and out of, and then I'm done. And it only attaches with this strap at the top. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is by making it all be one piece that only bends the direction that my elbow bends, it makes it safer, because any impact somewhere spreads force out over the whole structure. My elbow cannot bottom out, so the padding my elbow cannot be hit by the force of a blow. The padding is attached to the arm, so again I have that bellows effect that I've talked about. And because there's this single point attachment, and my other arm would be attached to this one, I have complete rotation and I have complete movement in all directions, right? Without my arm armor getting in the way and without any straps being tight on my arm. This part of the vambrace, in order to have this design, needs to be perfectly round so that I can rotate my hand inside the vambrace. The vambrace doesn't rotate, and the bones are not going to rub against anything because it's round. If it's oval shaped, it's going to rub when I turn. I wear just sweatbands as padding on my wrist inside of this, and the sweatband turns with my wrist so that there's nothing to rub against on the metal. The rest of it is all attached to the metal. You can see the padding inside. That's the arm armor. Low failure point. There's no straps to fail. There's no hinge to break. There's no buckle to break. It can't slide up or down. There's no points to break on my vambrace. There's only this strap, which is 2 straps. 1, 2, so that there's 2 points. So if one fails, I still have the other one. Hopefully that's all the missing part, and we'll cut back to the original video. to cash and get some. For dueling, it's not that important. You could have 3-piece greaves, you could have front greaves, whatever, because it's not nearly as much abuse, but this is certainly a luxury. Having it somewhat form-fitted is great. Easy on, easy off with a couple buckles is great. And again, huge fan of gluing the appropriate amount of foam to the inside of the metal rather than wearing elastic knee pads or shin pads underneath your armor for a number of reasons. Number one, it's one more thing that you can forget that falls out of your bag, that it takes you longer to put your armor on, longer to take it off. I have no knee pads that I wear with my armor. I literally wear spandex pants, stretch pants, partly for compression and partly to help keep me cool. I put this on over it, I put my leg on over that, and everything is already padded. I don't have to do any other pieces. So there's nothing for me to lose. There's no elastic to wear out. There's nothing to sag. After a long day, your padding starts to move around underneath. It gets uncomfortable. And it keeps you much, much cooler, because when the padding is attached to the armor, most people don't understand this, but plate armor is actually much cooler than soft armor or brigandine or plates, smaller plates. And the reason for that, it sounds counterintuitive, but the reason for that, even if you're in the sun and it's shining the sun on it, it's still cooler. Unless you sit perfectly still. If you stand still in your plate armor in the sun, you'll bake. But the minute you start fighting, it gets better. And the reason is because every time you move slightly different from the metal. The metal does not conform to your body because it's rigid. And every time you move one direction and then the other direction, there's a bellows effect. You create a space, and then you close that space, and you create the space, and that forces air in and out. And so you're essentially air conditioning yourself. You're moving air in and out of your armor every time you move if you have plate armor. Even if your plate armor is fairly well fitted, it's never perfectly fitted. There's always a small amount of space that is going to be created and then eliminated and then created and eliminated. Every time that's done, there's a bellows effect, and the amount of force of that is way more than any resistance they could have. So that air is moving back and forth. However, if that air is moving back and forth between your padding and your armor, far away from your skin, because foam is insulation, you are insulated from that cooling effect and you don't get it. And so you stay hot. By putting the padding on the armor, the padding is on the outside of the bellows, so the air that is moving back and forth every time you move is next to your skin. The padding moves with the armor instead of staying glued to your skin and the armor moving separate from the padding. As someone who came from Florida and has fought in Florida for many years, I can tell you that attaching the padding to the armor instead of wearing pads is a huge heat dissipator. You'll notice going back to the armor, it's the same thing. I don't have a lot of padding in here. I have some high-tech gel padding, but you notice it's fairly thin, but that's all the padding I have. I don't wear padded gambeson under it. I don't wear knee pads, elbow pads under it. I rely on the padding that's in the armor, plus the fact that the armor is very rigid and is one big piece. And so even though there are areas that are not padded, it doesn't matter, because when it gets hit, it gets spread out, and the areas that have padding are the areas that contact me, and they contact me in the places where I want them to, so that the force is distributed to the structures on my body that are good at accepting force. So for example, the point of the elbow here on the outside, that's an ouchie. You never want force there, so I have enough padding on either side of it that it's lifted up, and that does not make contact with the metal. There is a little padding over that bone, but it's not actually touching me unless I get hit hard enough for it to bottom out, and it prevents me from hitting the metal. But under normal movement circumstances, basically the padding above and below that spot keeps this from being in contact with any padding or armor, and so it's protected. And I have to get hit really hard for the padding to even come into contact with the bone. Same thing with the point of the elbow. Most people need a lot of armor, a lot of padding on the point of the elbow, because when your arm is bent, you get hit in this direction. It can be very painful. But because the arm is riveted together and it's relatively solid, it can't actually bottom out. It can't actually touch my elbow. The rear brace and the van brace interact in such a way that they cannot spread enough to allow the elbow cop to come close enough to actually make contact with the point of my elbow. The point of my elbow can never make contact with this metal unless you destroy the armor. Moving on to the body armor, not much to say about the body armor. I made it myself. I'm pretty proud of it, but nothing special about it. It's a brig. Again, the philosophy that fewer larger plates are better than many small plates. In order to make that comfortable, they need to be able to slide a little bit, and they need to be shaped to your body appropriately, which is why I made it myself, so that I could tailor it exactly to my body instead of somebody trying to mail me something. Larger plates are more protective. They also keep you cooler. They also ultimately weigh less because there's less overlap. Again, this is all titanium. Let me move on to the shoulders. So this is much more shoulder than I actually need for dueling. I could get a good dent at DragonCon. Somebody nailed me with an axe. They came up to me afterwards and was like, "Oh, I gave you that dent. I was really excited." And I didn't remember it because it didn't hurt. But I can see where it's deformed, so I'm going to have to hammer that out. But these titanium shoulders are attached to the brig, so they're way more protection than what you ever need for dueling. In fact, if I'm dueling and I'm not doing longsword, if I'm only doing sword and buckler or sword and shield, and I'm not profiling, I will sometimes take those off. And I am leaving a little gap here, but the rear brace comes up very high, and the shoulder armor comes out pretty low, and it protects, and maybe I can put a little plate underneath. I don't have them right now because I gave them to my ex, but I can put a little plate underneath to cover that gap, but I don't need nearly as much protection. For longsword, this is great because you can take hard enough shots on the shoulders that it matters. And for Buhurt, this is really great. But if you notice, there's considerable overlap between this and the top of my arm armor. It's all titanium, so I don't care about the weight too much. And that overlap makes it great. One of the mistakes people make with these style of large shoulders is that they put the anchor point of the shoulder too far down on the arm. It should be very close to the neck. In fact, in period, they were often attached to the gorget. Sometimes they're pointed, they're never attached to the body armor like this. This is a modern thing, but they're often attached to a gambeson, but sometimes they're also attached to a gorget. You can get this on. There we go. So, all right, I got my armor on, so that's strapped. If you'll notice, this point at the top that's attaching my shoulder armor is very close to my neck. It's actually right up against my gorget, as close as it can possibly be. And the reason for that is because when I lift my arm, this whole part needs to be able to lift up a little bit independently. Even though it articulates and it bends, it also needs to be able to collapse upward. And if it's attached down here, it won't do that. It moves with the arm instead of above the arm and rising on it, which makes it less protective and more encumbering and less comfortable. And definitely less protective, because when I straighten my arm up and this gets hit, the force is actually going up on the armor and on the arm armor, and it's not hitting my shoulder at all. That's how I was able to get this, whichever side it's on, that's how I was able to get this huge dent, which was a pretty hard shot in order to get that dent, because this is pretty thick titanium. I think it's 1.4, 1.5 millimeter titanium. In order to get that dent and not have a bruise and not be hurt in the shoulder, your armor has to fit right. Has to overlap appropriately. So we go down to leg armor. I'm not going to say too much about the leg armor, because most of you probably won't want to buy this anyways from American Armor and Marcus. It's great stuff. It's not the most aesthetically appealing armor, but it's very durable. It's made out of much tougher titanium than you usually get out of Eastern Europe, but that doesn't really matter. And whatever event you have leg armor, the important thing to say about this leg armor, and I busted a rivet this weekend, is the way it's attached. So again, I have high-tech foam glued to the inside of my armor. Then I have, this is essentially my padded gambeson, even though it's not really gambeson. I'm using a 3D mesh cloth like they use in racing car seats. And that is riveted firmly to the armor so that it moves with the armor, so that there's space created for that bellows effect between the arm and my leg. And that fabric also acts as my closure mechanism. I have no buckles, I have no leather. Buckles fail. When they fail, they're hard to replace. Leather stretches and changes shape. You get hot and wet and soggy. Suddenly your armor doesn't fit the same. It busts inappropriately. The only failure I had this weekend that actually slowed me down was this piece of leather actually ripped. Not from getting hit. I'm sure somebody who was grappling me probably grabbed it and pulled it off without really, maybe they were doing it on purpose, but probably by accident. And so I had to fix that. But other than that, I've never had a failure in this kind of system. And so by having the padding riveted to the inside of the armor, again, I save a step. I put the armor on very easily. I have several points with grommets that the strings go through. Everything is redundant. Every single piece that I go to has at least 2 points next to each other. So that if a string fails, my armor doesn't fail. Another important thing to think about that, some people make a mistake about this. Most period designs that are pointed have multiple points, and what a lot of modern people do is they take their multiple points. I've got 2 cords here, and they put one cord through one hole, and they put the other cord through the other hole, and then they tie them together in a square knot. That's a huge mistake, because that is essentially one point of failure. If that knot fails, the armor fails. Instead, what you should do is 2 separate knots, and the knot is not against the other cord. The knot is what the actual name of the knot is also called a point. And all it is an overhand knot with a slip on it. Looks like that. I'll zoom in on that in post. And that pulls through against a grommet so it can't go through. And then its buddy next to it does the same thing. And if it's a piece of leg armor, then you want to have more than 2, you probably 3 or 4. And each one is tied individually. They should not be tied together. Because for one thing, this knot doesn't slip over time. Once you tie it, it is where it is and it stays until you're finished. And then when you want to get it out, you pull it and you're out. If you use a square knot or a bow or anything else that is easy to untie that you can get out of, that means it will also slip over time and your armor will lose shape. I have never seen anybody who ties 2 pieces together that didn't have one of 2 problems or both. Problem number 1, they loosen up over time. Halfway through the day, you have to tighten them. Problem number 2, the end of the day, they go to take it off, they can't untie it. So each point should be an overhand knot, and I can do it with one hand because I've practiced for years, with a loop. Ta-da! That will not change shape, it will not do anything. It can get hit with a sword, it doesn't make any difference, there's nothing to break, there's no buckle to break, there's no tongue on a buckle to break, there's no hole in a piece of leather to rip out. This is extremely strong cord, and when I want out, I untie it and I'm out. You can put as many of those on your armor as you want to make it secure. So that's number 1. Padding is attached to the armor. This is loose because I blew up a rivet. Let me show you the other one as an example. There you go. So if you notice this one, knee padding is included. It's attached to the armor. It's sewn together in one piece and then riveted onto the armor. That also acts as my point to close the armor. I have a little extra backplate there, but it doesn't really matter. And another thing about points as opposed to leather. Leather and buckles fail spectacularly. That means they work and they're perfectly fine, and then one day they break and you're done. You don't know anything about it. These fail incrementally. If you notice this white tuft here, that's where the stuffing is coming out of my cord because my cord is wearing out. This piece of cord was put on here in 2018, so I've been doing steel fighting and SCA fighting and EMP fighting with this armor, with this cord since 2018. And since about 2022, I've had a rip here. It's been coming apart. It hasn't completely failed yet. I have another string, so if it does fail, I've got a replacement, but I see that it's failing, and all I have to do is pull this cord out from the other side, tie a new cord, put it through there, and I'm ready to go. If it fails during an event, I have extra pieces of cord in my bag. I can just grab a piece and throw it on there. I don't have to find an armor, I don't have to find a hole punch, I don't have to do any of that stuff. Just get a new piece of cord, have a new point, have a new point. And the point will fail in degrees. Some of the threads will rip, then some more will rip, then some more will rip. It will never rip all at once. It will always tell you it's going to fail before it fails. That's enough of that. Next important thing. How do you attach it to your waist? I made this myself. This is my own custom seatbelt, so you can't get one of these, but what you can get is one of the many seatbelts that people make. And when I say seatbelt, this is an important term. The reason it's called a seatbelt is because it's in the shape of a C. When you lay it flat on the ground, it doesn't look like a straight band. It's curved. And then when you put it on your body, the inside of the curve is at the top and the outside of the curve is at the bottom, so that it flares. So it's a little bit skirt-like when you attach it. And that helps it to stay above your hips and not slide down. A lot of what they call seatbelts that you can buy now from some of the armorers overseas, they've picked up on the idea that we Americans like seatbelts, and so they've started making them, but they don't realize that the C means that it needs to be this shape, and they're making them as straight bands. And they'll still work depending on your body type. You may be able to just cinch them down enough to where they work. But what's much better is to have the top of the belt needs to be tighter and angled in versus the bottom of the belt, and that keeps it from sagging down. This is important because you don't want the belt to be up at your quote-unquote natural waist. Okay, this is where you would, if you wanted to cinch in a belt medievally, most of the time it's up here. But what you really want is for the bottom of the belt to be very low on your hips. See, this rondelle will help you see where it's at. This is where my leg armor is attached. This is the only place my leg armor is attached. Okay. I have a super heavy duty strap here, and this could be a single point failure. This is the only place in my armor that's a single point failure because I like that mobility. And this is important because this is close to the natural joint. Where my leg bends, where my hip bone is, the attachment point for my leg armor is close to that actual movement. The mistake that people make is that they have straps up here. Do it this way. They have straps up here, and the leg armor's down here, and there's a long strap between the leg and the armor. And the problem with that is, when I bend my leg, those 2 points get closer together. That means it gets slack. That means the leg falls down. And then when I straighten my leg out, those two parts get farther apart, the leg moves up. This makes the leg armor not fit appropriately. And people come up with all these crazy ways to try and fix this problem by putting extra straps and the crosses and all kinds of weird stuff in order to keep their leg armor from sagging. All of which is the wrong way to solve the problem, or it's a problem that shouldn't exist in the first place. Because if you create your attachment point for your leg armor appropriately so that it is at the level of the joint, then there is no movement between the belt and the leg armor when you put it on. I'm not going to bother attaching my knees. Actually, maybe I should just for demonstration purposes. Because you can see, once I tie this on, I'm only going to do one of my two straps here for the sake of brevity, so you don't have to watch my video. Although I could do the second one and edit it out. But anyway, my knees are going to move because they're not attached. But if you watch, my leg armor doesn't go up or down or slide against my leg. It stays perfectly in place versus my leg no matter what direction I move. I can do a forward roll. I can kneel down on the ground, get back up. There is no sound, there is no movement, there is no sliding of my leg armor up or down. And it doesn't require any straps going across. It doesn't require a whole bunch of points on the leg armor. What I could do is I could put some extra holes and put some loose strings between this and my belt as a backup with the idea that they're always loose in case this failed. Then my leg armor wouldn't fall off, but they should always be loose. The reality is the leg armor should be hanging from, and it could be multiple straps, but they all need to be right next to each other within about an inch, right? The straps that are actually holding it need to be right next to each other, need to be in a small area, they need to be extremely short, no more than an inch long. Literally from the belt to the leg armor, that distance needs to be 1 inch or less. If it's 3 inches, when you move, it's going to change angles. The leg armor is going to slide up and down. You're going to create problems for yourself. Your armor is going to be less comfortable, and you're going to have to come up with crazy solutions to fix it instead of just attaching it the right way. Also, it bears the weight really well. These legs, even though they're titanium, are fairly heavy because they're very thick titanium. And I don't feel the weight of it at all because of the seatbelt. So you can't get this kind of seatbelt exactly because it's homemade, but you can get this basic shape. There are people selling this shape. If you look at it on the video, it's kind of dark, but you notice it's not a straight line. It's a C shape, and mine has little extra lobes that come down so that it's padding right here, and so that my attachment is as low as possible so that it's in this place where the hip joint moves, which is where it should be. Super important. I can't emphasize enough how much better your armor will be if you attach your leg armor appropriately in a single point the way it should be, and it can be, like I said, multiple points next to each other, as opposed to, and then people put straps over their shoulders, which means now you're bearing some of the weight of your leg armor on your shoulders. Don't do it. It's crazy. You're hurting yourself. You're hurting your game. Instead, get an appropriate seatbelt that fits appropriately around the waist, rests on the hips, rests low on the hips, and that the leg armor is attached close to. And I think that's all the information. Oh, one more thing. helmet, I guess. Let me turn my screen back on. Sorry I'm looking down all the time because I'm looking at myself, trying to see what, make sure I'm framed. All right, so here's my helmet. Love it or hate it, I love this helmet. I get tons and tons of compliments. People in the audience always love it. People think it's beautiful and historical. AC doesn't necessarily agree, whatever. Important things about the helmet though from a sports standpoint. Number one, it fits close at the bottom. There are a lot of people who don't like that and they try to make their helmets be wide so that there's nothing under the chin. I like this because people ask me about a Simon strap. Well, this helmet cannot come off my head unless it's open. As long as the helmet is closed, it is physically impossible for this helmet to go over my head because this gap is too small to go over my chin. This inside part of the chin is padded, right? So I do have a chin strap, and your chin strap should be a cup that fits on your chin, kind of like a football cup, but larger. So that, let me show you what this one looks like. Take my glasses off. So that it supports you. Again, you don't need multiple chin straps, you only need one. If your padding is put in appropriately so that it fits snug on your head, then your chin strap will look like this, right? So the way my chin strap works, part of it is in front, right below my lip, and part of it is underneath my chin. And it is attached very close to my ears so that it's a point where it can't, if the helmet goes up, it closes this way. If the helmet goes back, it closes this way. Either way, the helmet can't move, and it spreads the force across my chin and my jaw and even my cheeks slightly because it pulls in on my cheeks as opposed to like a strap across here which chokes you and a strap across here that pushes up on your tongue and makes it hard to breathe. Terrible mistake. If that chin strap is a little loose or if it starts to fail, then I bottom out on this padding on the inside of my helmet so my helmet still doesn't go anywhere. In fact, when I'm dueling as opposed to doing fives, a lot of times I don't buckle the chin strap at all because this is more than enough to keep my helmet in place. Something important to know. Another important thing, safety-wise, this is not as important for dueling, but I want to mention it anyway. Concussions are one of the worst things that can happen to you in this sport, also fairly common. You want to avoid concussions. One way to do that is to have a heavy helmet. That helps. One that's padded appropriately. There's lots of arguments about what is appropriate padding. I think the padding that most people use is too hard. Padding needs to be soft because the helmet needs to be able to move relative to your head. You don't want stiff concussion padding is usually too hard because it's designed for a plastic helmet that compresses. This helmet doesn't compress, so the padding we need is softer and a little thicker. So that's one part. But the other part is, if you'll notice, this helmet comes down close to my shoulder and close to my wrist. So it's not resting on my shoulders. I can move my head, I can tilt slightly, I can tilt back a little bit, I can tilt forward a little bit. If you notice, I bottom out. I can only go that far back, I can only go that far forward. When I put my armor on, it's even less. I can go forward and back a little bit, but not very far. And that's good, because when I get hit, my head gets jacked back, I want my helmet to stop. I want it to hit my armor and stop moving so that it doesn't hyperextend my neck or jiggle my brain pan too much, right? Same thing going forward. If somebody grabs the front of my helmet, head begins to bring my, try to yank my head off. I'm an old man, I don't want to hurt my cervical vertebrae and get it broken. So when somebody pulls this way, what they're really doing after a certain point, they're not pulling on my neck anymore. All they're doing is they're pushing the bib into the gorget of my armor, and it's pressing on my chest. And there's no stress on my neck at all. Safety for wrestling. If I fall down and I take a bad fall so that my head hits, my neck doesn't twist funny and impact my brain pan. Instead, the helmet hits, then the helmet hits my body armor, and then my body armor takes a lot of the abuse instead of my head and my neck. Super important. And this is another nice trick. There's a little space here I can move around. If I see a shot coming, I can shrug my shoulders. Now, my helmet isn't resting on my head, it's resting on my shoulders. That shot is no longer hitting my brain pan, it's now hitting my shoulder armor. And then I can relax, and I can move my head again. I think everybody's helmet should have some elements of that. There are different shapes and different designs. I like this because the flare, as opposed to having a straight bottom like a lot of earlier period helmets, allows me to rest on my shoulders, rest on my chest in such a way that it's not an edge digging in, right? The angle of incidence is lower, and so it makes it more supportive, and it makes it more comfortable and safe when I get hit or when it gets knocked around. You can accomplish the same thing with an earlier period helmet that has an edge by making sure that whatever armor you have underneath has a plate for it to land on, such that the plate spreads the force out and it doesn't dig into you, right? Some people don't do that. Instead, they have a thick camail or aventail that covers the gap between the helmet and the body armor, and it's kind of squishy, and so it makes it hard for them to move their head because it's a little bit in the way, but it's squishy, but it also doesn't bottom out. When it gets hit, that squishiness gets compressed, the aventail gets knocked out of the way, and the head can go way past its normal safe level of bend, as opposed to bottoming out. So when you're making your helmet choice, that's something I would think about. Again, not super important. This is supposed to be a video about dueling. Not super important for dueling because you don't generally get hit hard enough for that to matter, but it is something to consider when you're talking about a helmet. My helmet is not super heavy. It is not perfectly dueling optimized. If it was, it would be lighter than it is. And it's not perfectly Buhurt optimized, because if it was, it would be slightly heavier than it is. It's basically somewhere in the middle. So let me see how heavy it is. How much does this helmet weigh? Oops, I have to turn this on first. All right, 0. There we go. Okay. My helmet weighs 10 pounds, 10.7 pounds. So about, what is that, 10 pounds, 9 ounces, 10 pounds, 10 ounces. That's very, very light for a helmet that somebody wants to wear in Buhurt. And the only reason I'm not worried about a concussion is because with wearing this with people hitting me with axes is for the reasons I've mentioned before, that I have it optimally padded. There's enough space in there. It bottoms out. All those other things that protect me. But it's light enough at 10 and a half, a little bit more than 10 and a half pounds, almost 11 pounds. It's light enough that it's not super fatiguing to wear when I'm dueling. Again, I'm not throwing my head around when I'm dueling. I don't do a whole lot of dodging. I always think it's better to block than to dodge. Voiding is different. If you want to step back in order to avoid a shot, that's fine. But ducking the head out of the way, I think, is almost always a bad choice, because the amount of energy it takes with all your armor on to move your head out of the way and then move it back into place is much bigger than the amount of energy it takes to put a hand in the way and block it, or to just take a little step and get out of the way. So I'm very much a big fan of remaining erect, always trying to keep my head directly over the middle of my hips, not leaning side to side, not ever leaning back, occasionally leaning a little bit forward, but not spending too much time leaning too far forward. There are styles that are perfectly valid that work very well for sword and shield that involve leaning far over to keep your legs farther from your opponent. That's fine. It's not my thing. I think it robs you of power and it robs you of endurance. It does give you an advantage, yes, an easy way to protect your feet. So that's a choice. But it should be an intentional choice. You're giving up something in order to gain something. It should never be, I'm leaning over just because I'm not paying attention and I'm leaning too far. You should never have your head too far in front to where your neck muscles are working to support your helmet. Your helmet should always be balanced on your neck. You should always have your feet under you, be centered up. You should be able to throw blows with body motion, right? Without throwing your body off to the side, without getting off of your hips. So one of the drills that I always teach people to do when I first teach them a sword fight, it doesn't even involve a sword. Stand in the mirror, look in the mirror, put a piece of tape on the mirror, basically where your nose or your eye is, so that you have a reference point that you can see. Right? So now I'm looking in the mirror and I've got this reference point where I can see where my head is. And then now I'm going to turn side to side, and I'm not doing a very good job right now because I can see it in the camera. And I'm going to turn side to side using my feet and my hips, rotating my body without my head moving. So I don't want my head to move side to side when I turn. I don't want my head to move up and down when I turn. It's going to stay in the exact same spot. And I'm going to rotate as far as I can without my head moving. It's going to stay in the same spot. Right? And that's a skill that you never finish developing. I actually go back now, if I'm starting to train again, I go back and I literally go to the basics, put my hand on my hips, do some rotation, practice practice my head not moving while I'm doing the rotation. Head remains perfectly still, body rotates. Throw the shot, rotate the body, use the hips and shoulder without moving the head. Sometimes it fools the judges. They think your head's not moving, therefore your body's not moving, you're not throwing power. This garbage, screw them. Have good mechanics. Imagine that you've got a spike going from your tailbone up through the top of your head. You can rotate on that spike, but you can't bend over and break the spike. So you're gonna rotate, get your power. You can move it forward and back. Don't bend it. You can rotate on it. Don't bend it. All right, that's enough for one video. Say goodnight, Lucky. She's not gonna like the camera.